There is a photograph of Gene Tierney taken late in her life that almost nobody talks about anymore. Not the glamorous publicity portraits from 20th Century Fox with their carefully constructed lighting and retouched perfection. Not the famous stills where the camera lingered on her face as though it had discovered something impossible, something beyond the ordinary realm of human beauty. Not the posters that called her the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, those bold pronouncements that turned a person into an adjective, a standard, an impossible ideal. This photograph is quieter than that, so much quieter that you might almost miss it if you were not looking carefully. She is older in this image. The years are visible now, written gently across her features in a way that Hollywood once would have forbidden. She is sitting alone at a small table near a window, the kind of simple domestic scene that her publicity team would never have approved during her prime. The room is plain, without decoration or pretense. Her shoulders are slightly bent forward, curved inward in the posture of someone who has carried invisible weight for decades. One hand is wrapped around a coffee cup that appears to have gone cold long ago, forgotten in the midst of thoughts that clearly occupy her far more than the temperature of a beverage. Outside the window there is winter light, thin and grey, the kind that reveals rather than flatters, and inside, behind her eyes, there is the expression of someone who has spent years, perhaps entire decades, trying to return to herself. What makes the image haunting is not sadness exactly, though there is sadness present in the frame if you know where to look for it. It is distance, the strange, unbridgeable emotional distance between the woman the world thought it knew and the woman who remained after the applause stopped, after the cameras were packed away, after the industry moved on to younger faces and fresher fantasies. Because the truth is that Gene Tierney spent much of her life being looked at without truly being seen. She was observed, certainly, studied, photographed, analyzed, desired, and discussed endlessly in columns and magazines and breathless fan letters. But observation is not the same thing as recognition. Looking at someone is not the same as seeing them. And in the end, after the awards and the affairs and the gossip columns and the psychiatric hospitals and the betrayals both personal and professional, she became something Hollywood has never known how to process properly, something that makes the entire machinery uncomfortable even now. A suffering person who could no longer perform suffering beautifully. This is the story of Gene Tierney, and it is not the story most people think they know. People remember the face. Of course they remember the face. How could anyone forget it? They remember Laura, that dreamlike film where she existed as much as memory as flesh. They remember elegance captured in black and white, preserved forever in a medium that never ages, never changes, never allows its subjects to become ordinary. They remember mystery, that carefully cultivated quality that studios marketed as though it were perfume. Some remember whispers about mental instability or breakdowns, those vague terms that people use when they want to acknowledge suffering without actually engaging with its reality. But beneath all of that surface narrative, beneath the mythology and the marketing and the retrospective tributes, was a woman who spent years fighting schizophrenia-like symptoms, severe depression, multiple institutionalizations, crushing guilt, profound abandonment, and a Hollywood machine that loved fragile women only when fragility could still be photographed attractively, when it could be framed and lit and turned into something that sold tickets rather than something that required genuine human compassion. And what remains now, when we look back across the decades with whatever limited wisdom time provides, is not merely the tragedy of a movie star who struggled with mental illness. It is the story of what happens when beauty becomes a prison people refuse to believe you are trapped inside, when the very thing the world celebrates about you becomes the wall separating you from genuine human connection. Gene Tierney was born in Brooklyn in 1920 into wealth, privilege, and social polish, all the external markers that society assumes produce happiness, or at least stability. From the outside, peering in through the lens of class and prosperity, it appeared to be the kind of childhood people imagine should produce emotional security. Her father was successful in business, ambitious and driven in the way men of that era were expected to be. The family had money, real money, not simply comfort, but actual wealth. She attended elite schools where daughters of prominent families learned languages and manners and all the subtle codes of upper-class behavior. There were European trips and carefully arranged social expectations, and all the trappings of a life that looked, from every external angle, extraordinarily fortunate. But emotional isolation can exist inside beautiful homes just as easily as anywhere else. Perhaps more easily, because the beauty of the setting makes the loneliness harder to name, harder to justify, harder to explain to people who see only the surface. The Tierney household valued composure above almost everything else. Presentation mattered enormously, appearance mattered, proper behavior mattered. Emotional control was not simply encouraged but expected, demanded, treated as a fundamental requirement of civilized existence. And children raised inside highly controlled emotional environments, where feelings are treated as disruptions rather than information, often learn a dangerous lesson very early in life: that difficult feelings should be hidden before they inconvenience other people, that sadness or anger or fear or confusion are not problems to be solved together, but problems to be concealed individually, that love might be conditional on your ability to remain pleasant, agreeable, undemanding. Gene was observant from childhood, sensitive in ways that some children are, attuned to emotional undercurrents that others miss entirely. She was quiet in ways that adults often mistake for maturity, not understanding that sometimes quietness in children is not peace, but adaptation, a learned strategy for navigating environments that feel unsafe for authentic expression. She learned how to read rooms before she learned almost anything else, how to sense mood shifts, how to perform calmness even when she felt turmoil inside, how to become agreeable, pleasant, the kind of daughter who did not create problems. Years later, when she was famous, people would describe her as gracious and poised, as though these were simple personality traits rather than survival strategies developed in childhood. But poise is not always peace. Grace is not always ease. Sometimes it is survival. Sometimes it is armor. Sometimes it is the face you learn to show the world because you discovered early that your real face was unwelcome. She originally had no overwhelming ambition to become a star. Acting emerged almost accidentally after a studio executive noticed her beauty at a social function and saw immediately what Hollywood always sees in beautiful women: an opportunity for profit. And almost immediately, faster than she could possibly have prepared for, her appearance became the defining fact of her existence. Not her intelligence, though she was intelligent. Not her sensitivity, though she was deeply sensitive. Not her hopes or fears or dreams, or any of the interior qualities that actually make a person who they are. Her face. Only her face. Hollywood in the 1940s was an empire built on manufacturing fantasies, a factory system that took human beings and transformed them into products, into dreams that could be sold to audiences desperate for escape from their own ordinary lives. And Gene Tierney fit perfectly into one of its favorite fantasies of all, one that the industry has never tired of producing because audiences have never tired of consuming it. The unreachable woman. Cool but vulnerable, elegant but wounded, intelligent but soft enough not to intimidate audiences, especially male audiences who wanted to feel superior even while feeling desire. Beautiful in a way that seemed almost supernatural, as though she existed on a different plane than ordinary people. The camera adored her because it could project almost anything onto her face: mystery, longing, sophistication, danger, innocence. She became a screen in both senses of the word, something that showed images and something that concealed what lay behind. But what did Gene Tierney actually want? What did she dream about when she was alone? What did she hope for herself beyond what the studio system hoped to extract from her? That question becomes strangely difficult to answer the more famous she became. Not because she became more complex, but because she became less visible, even as she became more watched. Because once Hollywood decides what role you serve in the public imagination, your own inner life starts disappearing beneath it. The performance becomes the person, the image replaces the reality, and slowly, sometimes without anyone noticing until it is far too late, the woman underneath begins to vanish. When Laura premiered in 1944, Gene Tierney became immortal in the way that only cinema can make someone immortal, frozen forever at a particular age in a particular moment, preserved in silver nitrate and light. The film itself feels almost dreamlike now, all these decades later, saturated with the particular atmospheric quality that film noir achieved, that sense of existing slightly outside normal reality. A detective falls in love with a woman who may already be dead. Desire becomes obsession. Memory becomes fantasy. The entire story revolves around a woman who is more idea than person, who exists primarily as a portrait, a representation, something to be contemplated rather than known. And perhaps that is why the role fit so perfectly, why audiences responded so powerfully to her performance. There was something in Gene Tierney herself that understood what it meant to be observed without being seen, to be desired without being known, to exist as an image that other people projected their fantasies onto. She did not have to pretend to understand Laura Hunt. On some level, she already was Laura Hunt. Audiences did not merely admire Gene Tierney after that film. Admiration would have been simpler, cleaner, less consuming. They projected onto her. They made her into whatever they needed her to be. Men became infatuated with an idea of femininity that had very little to do with who she actually was. Women copied her style, trying to capture some of that impossible elegance for themselves. Critics called her ethereal, otherworldly, as though she were not quite human, as though she existed in some rarefied atmosphere beyond the ordinary messiness of human existence. Hollywood executives recognized instantly that they had found something rare and valuable, a face capable of carrying longing itself, of embodying desire in a way that transcended individual stories or characters. But success in Hollywood often creates a cruel contradiction, one that the industry has never addressed honestly, because addressing it would require acknowledging its own destructive nature. The more adored someone becomes publicly, the less room they have privately to fall apart. The higher the pedestal, the more catastrophic any sign of human weakness becomes. The more perfect the image, the more threatening any crack in that perfection appears. And Gene was already carrying vulnerabilities that fame only intensified, fault lines that the pressure of celebrity would eventually fracture completely. She married Oleg Cassini in 1941 against her family's wishes, a rebellion that probably felt more significant than it actually was. The marriage was passionate, glamorous, volatile, the kind of high-intensity relationship that looks romantic from the outside and feels chaotic from within. Cassini was charismatic and ambitious, a designer with his own aspirations and his own ego, but also controlling in ways that grew more pronounced over time. Their relationship existed inside the pressure cooker of celebrity culture, where appearances mattered more than emotional honesty, where problems were concealed rather than addressed, where the performance extended into private life, because there was no clear boundary between public and private anymore. Then came the event that changed everything, the moment that would haunt Gene Tierney for the rest of her life. In 1943, while pregnant with her first child, Gene attended a public appearance to support war bond efforts. It was the kind of patriotic duty that stars were expected to perform during wartime, smiling for cameras and shaking hands and making people feel hopeful. During the event, a woman broke quarantine to meet her despite having rubella, German measles, a disease that most people recovered from without serious complications. The woman later confessed this proudly to Gene, actually sought her out to tell her, pleased with herself for having overcome her illness to meet a movie star, completely unaware of what she had done. At the time, nobody fully understood the consequences. Gene continued with her pregnancy. The months passed, and then she gave birth to her daughter, Daria. Daria was born severely disabled, blind, partially deaf, with profound developmental challenges, all linked to congenital rubella syndrome, all traceable directly to that moment when a woman desperate to meet a celebrity broke quarantine and transmitted a virus. The guilt nearly destroyed her. Not because she had done anything wrong. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply shown up to a public event, smiled for the cameras, shaken hands with admirers. She had performed the exact role Hollywood expected of her. But grief has a way of searching desperately for someone to blame, and often the nearest target becomes oneself. Logic does not matter. Reason does not matter. The mind needs somewhere to put the pain, and if no external target is available or acceptable, it turns inward. Gene withdrew emotionally in the months and years following Daria's birth. How could she not? She was grieving the child she had expected, while simultaneously trying to care for the child she had, all while processing overwhelming guilt that had no rational basis but felt absolutely real. The marriage deteriorated further under the strain, both partners drowning in their own ways, unable to reach each other across the distance that tragedy had created between them. Hollywood offered sympathy publicly, of course. There were kind statements and flowers, and the performance of compassion that the industry knows how to manufacture when it serves public relations purposes. But privately, the machinery kept moving. It always keeps moving. Studios still needed films, production schedules still needed to be met, publicists still needed appearances and interviews and photo shoots, contracts still needed to be fulfilled. The performance had to continue. And what happened when that unbearable private pain collided with an industry that rewarded emotional concealment, that demanded beauty and grace and pleasantness regardless of what was happening beneath the surface? The answer would unfold slowly, quietly at first, in ways that people around her probably noticed but chose to ignore, because acknowledging the problem would have required addressing it. Then, all at once, the collapse that had been building for years became impossible to ignore any longer. There is a tendency in celebrity culture to describe mental illness as though it arrives suddenly, like weather, like an external force that strikes without warning. A breakdown, a collapse, a moment when everything falls apart. But for many people, psychological suffering accumulates quietly for years before anyone around them recognizes the damage, before the symptoms become visible enough to demand acknowledgement. Mental illness is often not a sudden event, but a gradual erosion, a slow fracturing that happens beneath the surface long before the cracks become visible. For Gene Tierney, the deterioration was gradual, a progressive worsening that probably could have been addressed earlier if anyone had been paying attention to her as a person rather than as a product. The insomnia worsened first. Sleep became difficult, then nearly impossible. Nights stretched out endlessly, hours of darkness filled with thoughts that circled without resolution. Then the anxiety intensified, moving from occasional nervousness to constant dread, a baseline state of fear that colored everything. Then periods of emotional instability that frightened people close to her, mood swings that seemed disproportionate to their triggers, reactions that seemed to come from somewhere deeper and more damaged than the present moment. She continued acting because acting was the only structure Hollywood allowed her to keep, the only role she was still permitted to inhabit. Films like Leave Her to Heaven revealed something startling in retrospect, something that becomes almost uncomfortable to watch if you know what was happening in her life off-screen. Her performances carried emotional currents far darker than the glamorous publicity surrounding her career. In that film, she plays a possessive, psychologically disturbed woman whose beauty masks violent instability, whose perfect surface conceals profound damage. She plays jealousy and obsession and psychological disintegration with a conviction that feels less like acting and more like channeling something real and frightening. Audiences were fascinated by the performance. Critics praised it. The film was successful. Hollywood loves anguish when it appears elegant on screen, when it can be framed and scored and turned into entertainment. It struggles profoundly with anguish in real life, when it disrupts production schedules and makes people uncomfortable and cannot be resolved in 2 hours with dramatic music. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Gene's emotional state had become increasingly fragile in ways that could no longer be entirely concealed or managed. Depression deepened from sadness into something much darker, a gravitational force that pulled her down regardless of circumstances. Relationships failed because she was too damaged to sustain them, and the people around her were too unprepared to support her. She experienced intense mood swings and episodes that today would likely receive far more nuanced psychiatric evaluation than they did at the time, when diagnostic categories were cruder and treatment options were limited and brutal. But mid-century America approached mental illness with fear and bluntness, especially when it came to women. A troubled man might be called tortured, complicated, intense. His suffering might even be romanticized as evidence of depth or artistic sensitivity. A troubled woman was often called difficult, unstable, hysterical, or dangerous. Her suffering was seen as weakness, as failure, as something shameful that needed to be hidden away. Gene began seeking psychiatric help because she understood that something was profoundly wrong, that she was losing herself in ways she could not control. But treatment during that era could be brutal, guided more by theories than by evidence, more by control than by compassion. Institutionalization was common, the default response to mental illness that could not be concealed. Medication was primitive, based on limited understanding of brain chemistry. Shame surrounded everything, making it nearly impossible to speak honestly about psychological suffering without being stigmatized permanently. And perhaps most devastatingly for Gene, Hollywood viewed mental illness as contamination, as something infectious that might spread to the image of a film or a studio, a secret to be managed, an inconvenience, a financial liability, a problem to be solved or suppressed, not a human emergency, not a woman drowning who needed someone to pull her to safety. The studios that once celebrated her face, that built entire marketing campaigns around her beauty and mystery, now became nervous around her suffering. It made them uncomfortable, it complicated things, it interfered with the fantasy they were trying to sell. Executives whispered in meetings about whether she was still reliable, still bankable, still worth the investment. Friends distanced themselves, perhaps because they did not know how to help, or perhaps because proximity to her struggle threatened their own carefully maintained images. The loneliness intensified, becoming nearly total. She was surrounded by people in the industry, but profoundly isolated in her experience. And through all of this, through every episode and hospitalization and failed treatment, Gene remained deeply self-aware. That may have been the cruelest part of her experience. She understood that she was losing control. She could observe her own deterioration with terrible clarity. She understood people were watching it happen, that her struggle was becoming gossip, entertainment, something people discussed with a mixture of pity and fascination. And she understood that the beauty which once protected her, which opened doors and created opportunities and made people want to be near her, could no longer save her from what was happening inside her own mind. In 1953, Gene Tierney admitted herself to a psychiatric institution, a decision that required enormous courage in an era when mental hospitalization carried enormous social stigma and often meant the end of a career. That decision alone, that willingness to seek help despite knowing the cost, reveals something important about who she was beneath the image. She was trying to survive. She was trying to get better. She chose honesty about her condition over protecting her career. But courage does not guarantee humane treatment, and seeking help does not guarantee receiving it. She underwent insulin shock therapy, a procedure that sounds horrifying to modern ears because it was horrifying. Patients were injected with massive doses of insulin to induce comas, based on theories that severe mental illness could somehow be reset neurologically, that inducing physical crisis might somehow address psychological crisis.
The treatments were terrifying experiences that left patients disoriented and traumatized. They were disorienting, erasing memory and sense of self in ways that were supposed to be therapeutic, but often simply created new damage on top of existing suffering. Sometimes they were physically dangerous, carrying risks of permanent injury or death. Gene later described periods of profound confusion and emotional devastation during these years in her institutionalization, windows of time that she could barely remember, whole sections of her life that became blank or fragmented. There were also reports of electroconvulsive therapy, electrical currents sent through the brain to induce seizures. Again, modern conversations about psychiatric care are far more sophisticated than they were then. ECT is still used today in carefully controlled circumstances for treatment-resistant depression. But at the time, many treatments prioritized control over understanding, compliance over healing, managing symptoms over addressing causes. And inside those institutions, Jean experienced something Hollywood had never prepared her for, something that was in some ways more disorienting than the treatments themselves. Anonymity. No makeup department arriving early to create the perfect face. No flattering lighting designed to emphasize her best features and conceal any imperfections. No scripts telling her what to say or how to move. No audience watching with admiration and desire. Just long corridors with industrial floors and fluorescent lighting. Medications distributed in small paper cups. Silence broken by distant sounds of other people suffering. And the frightening question of whether she would ever feel like herself again, whether there was still a self to return to, or whether the illness and the treatments had erased whoever she used to be. Mental illness strips away identity in layers, removing first the stability of mood, then the reliability of perception, then the continuity of memory, until you are no longer entirely sure who you are or who you have been. Celebrity culture does something strangely similar, replacing your actual identity with an image, a brand, a performance that eventually feels more real to everyone around you than your actual self. Perhaps that is why the experience became so psychologically devastating for Gene specifically. The person Gene Tierney had been publicly, the ethereal beauty, the mysterious star, no longer existed. The image could not be maintained inside an institution. The performance could not continue. But the person underneath, the actual human being, had never been fully allowed to develop safely either. She had been shaped by a controlling family, then by a controlling industry, never given space to become herself outside of other people's expectations and requirements. Who was she, stripped of both the image and the illness? That question had no easy answer. She later spoke about hallucinations that made reality unreliable, about paranoia that made trust impossible, about severe depressive episodes where the weight of existence became almost unbearable. Some modern commentators have speculated about schizophrenia, while others suggest bipolar disorder with psychotic features. The exact diagnosis remains debated historically because records are incomplete and diagnostic categories have changed substantially. But diagnostic precision is not really the heart of the story. Labels matter for treatment, but they do not capture experience. The heart of the story is suffering. A woman trapped between illness and an industry that had no language for compassion beyond publicity statements, no framework for responding to her as a human being, rather than as an asset that was no longer performing as expected. And still, somehow, she kept trying to return. That persistence, that refusal to simply disappear despite how much easier disappearing might have been, that matters more than any diagnosis. There are many forms of betrayal in Hollywood, ranging from the dramatic to the mundane, from the obvious to the subtle. Some are dramatic, the kinds of things that make headlines and destroy careers visibly. Most are quiet, almost invisible. The gradual withdrawal of support that happens without announcement or explanation. Gene Tierney's betrayal was not simply that executives stopped seeing her as bankable, though that happened. It was not simply that opportunities disappeared, though they did. It was that the system which profited enormously from her vulnerability abandoned her once vulnerability became inconvenient, once it could no longer be photographed attractively, once it demanded actual human response rather than simply providing material for compelling performances. The same industry that marketed her fragility as sophistication, that built her brand around a particular kind of haunted elegance, recoiled when the fragility became real and messy and disruptive. Film roles diminished as she aged and as her reputation for instability grew. Calls from directors and producers slowed, then stopped. Public fascination shifted from admiration to gossip, from celebration to something darker, a kind of watching that felt more like waiting for the next catastrophe than genuine interest in her well-being. The transformation was subtle but devastating. Hollywood does not always exile people openly with declarations and announcements. Sometimes it simply stops inviting them into the room. Calls go unreturned. Meetings get rescheduled indefinitely. Scripts go to other actresses without explanation. And for actresses specifically, aging compounded everything in ways it did not for actors. Men could age into character roles, into distinguished older parts, into new phases of their careers. Women, especially women whose value was defined primarily by beauty, simply became obsolete. The industry had built Gene's entire identity around impossible beauty. Once illness altered her reliability and emotional stability, once age began showing on the face that was supposed to remain timelessly perfect, the machinery began searching for younger replacements. This is one of the cruelest realities of fame, one that many people never understand until they experience it directly. People often confuse being needed with being loved. They feel the attention and the desire and the constant demands on their time and presence. And they interpret those things as affection, as genuine human connection. Gene had been needed, desperately needed. Studios needed her face to sell films. Magazines needed her image to sell copies. Audiences needed her to embody their fantasies about beauty and sophistication. But when her suffering interrupted production schedules and insurance became complicated, and public fantasies shifted to younger stars, she discovered how conditional much of that affection truly was. There were also personal betrayals beyond the professional ones. Her marriage to Oleg Cassini collapsed under the combined strain of grief and infidelity and incompatibility. Relationships afterward often carried their own instability and disappointment. She searched repeatedly for emotional safety, for someone who could see her rather than the image, and rarely found what she was looking for. Yet those who knew her later in life, after the fame had faded, after the worst of the psychiatric crises had passed, often described extraordinary warmth beneath the sadness. Humor that was sharp and self-aware. Intelligence that had never been given proper space to develop. Gentleness toward other people that came from having suffered deeply herself. An empathy born from pain. A woman capable of deep compassion because she understood what it meant to hurt, to be misunderstood, to be reduced to something simpler than you actually are. That complexity rarely survives celebrity mythology, which prefers simple narratives to complicated realities. Audiences prefer symbols that can be understood quickly and completely. The tragic beauty, the fallen star, the mad actress. These are stories we know how to tell, templates we can apply without thinking too deeply. Real people are harder to package. They contradict themselves. They contain multitudes. They do not fit neatly into the narratives we want to tell about them. One of the most moving aspects of Gene Tierney's story is that she did not entirely disappear, did not simply fade into complete obscurity or succumb entirely to illness or bitterness. She kept trying to live. That sounds simple, obvious even, but it is not. After years of treatment and emotional turmoil, after hospitalizations and therapies and medications, she slowly returned to acting in smaller capacities. Not major films, not leading roles, but work nonetheless. She remarried, this time to Texas oilman W. Howard Lee, a man outside the entertainment industry who provided a calmer and more stable life than Hollywood ever had or could have. And for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, Jean experienced something resembling peace. Not happiness exactly, not the bright emotion that magazine profiles always claimed stars possessed. Peace is different. Happiness is bright and temporary, dependent on circumstances, something that comes and goes. Peace is quieter, harder earned, more durable. Peace is what remains when you stop fighting yourself, when you accept what cannot be changed, when you find a way to exist without performing. She eventually wrote a memoir titled Self-Portrait, and what stands out about the book when you read it now is its honesty. There is very little self-mythologizing in it, very little of the careful image management that characterized most celebrity autobiographies of that era. No desperate attempt to rewrite the past into triumph, or to explain away the difficult years with convenient narratives. Instead, there is exhaustion, the tiredness of someone who has fought too many battles and no longer has energy for pretense. Reflection without bitterness, an attempt to understand what happened rather than simply condemn everyone involved. And dignity, a quiet insistence on telling her story in her own words, on being something more than the image people projected onto her. She wrote about psychiatric treatment plainly, without dramatizing or minimizing. About fear plainly, the terror of losing your mind and knowing you are losing it. About emotional collapse plainly, the experience of falling apart despite your best efforts to hold yourself together. That kind of honesty was unusual for stars of her era, when autobiography was usually another form of publicity, another carefully constructed performance. Many protected the illusion until death, maintaining the image to the very end because the image was all they had left. Jean no longer seemed interested in illusions. She had lived inside illusions for too long and paid too high a price for maintaining them. And maybe that was the final transformation of her life, the last and most important change. The woman once worshipped for appearing dreamlike became most powerful when she finally spoke as a human being, flawed and damaged and real. There is something deeply unsettling about Gene Tierney's story because it challenges one of society's oldest and most persistent fantasies, one that we still believe despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the fantasy that beauty protects people, that it functions as armor, that being desired is the same as being safe. Her entire career was built around extraordinary physical elegance. Directors filmed her like porcelain, like something precious and fragile that existed to be admired. Magazine profiles described her as though she existed above ordinary suffering, as though beauty somehow insulated a person from pain. But mental illness does not negotiate with glamour. It does not care what you look like. Depression does not spare beautiful people. Trauma does not become softer simply because the traumatized person once stood beneath studio lights and made audiences gasp. In some ways, beauty may even have deepened her isolation rather than protecting her from it. People projected perfection onto her for so long that they struggled to comprehend her pain once it surfaced openly. They could not reconcile the image with the reality. How could someone so beautiful be so unhappy? How could someone so desired feel so alone? And perhaps Jean herself struggled with that contradiction too. Internalized the message that her suffering did not make sense, that she should be grateful for opportunities and admiration rather than drowning in depression. Who are you when the thing the world values most about you cannot save you? When the quality everyone celebrates turns out to be irrelevant to your actual survival? Hollywood never answered that question. It usually doesn't. The industry survives by maintaining fantasy, not by resolving it, not by acknowledging the human cost of the images it creates. And yet Gene Tierney's life continues to resonate decades later, precisely because the illusion eventually cracked completely, because the gap between image and reality became impossible to ignore. What emerged underneath was painful, but it was real. And reality, however difficult, is what lasts. Gene Tierney died in 1991 at the age of 70, having outlived her fame by decades, having survived far longer than the image that once defined her. By then, Hollywood had already transformed itself several times over. The studio system that shaped her had collapsed. New stars had emerged and faded. New scandals replaced old ones. Entire generations knew her only through late-night television broadcasts of black and white films, if they knew her at all. But what she left behind remains strangely powerful, still capable of affecting people who discover her story or her films. She left behind performances that still feel emotionally modern, that carry weight and complexity that transcends their era. Laura remains one of the great films of the noir era, studied and analyzed and celebrated, not merely because Gene Tierney was beautiful in it, but because she understood something essential about loneliness and performance, and the gap between how we appear and who we are, long before the public understood it about her. She left behind her memoir, which remains one of the more quietly courageous autobiographies written by a Hollywood star of that generation, a document of survival and honesty. She left behind her children, including Daria, whom she never abandoned despite the overwhelming difficulty of that relationship. She left behind evidence of survival, proof that it is possible to endure almost unimaginable suffering and still find some measure of peace on the other side. And she left behind an uncomfortable truth about fame itself, one that we still struggle to acknowledge. That public worship and private suffering often exist side by side. That being adored by millions does not prevent loneliness. That beauty and talent and success do not protect anyone from the fundamental vulnerabilities of being human. In the end, Gene Tierney's life was not the story of a perfect woman destroyed by tragedy, though that is the simple version people sometimes tell. It was the story of an emotionally vulnerable human being trying to survive impossible pressures, while the world insisted on seeing only the surface, only the image, only the fantasy it needed her to be. That is what makes her story linger in the imagination decades after her death. Not merely the beauty, though the beauty is undeniable. Not merely the suffering, though the suffering was profound. But the unbearable distance between how deeply she hurt and how flawlessly she was expected to appear while hurting. The gap between the woman in the photographs and the woman sitting alone with cold coffee, trying to find herself after years of being turned into someone else's dream. And maybe that old photograph near the window captures all of it in ways that the glamorous publicity shots never could. The silence of a life after performance. The exhaustion of decades spent maintaining an impossible image. The dignity of simply existing without pretense. A woman once frozen forever in Hollywood light, sitting quietly at the edge of an ordinary afternoon, finally far away from the machinery that spent years turning her pain into spectacle, her vulnerability into profit, her face into a fantasy that had almost nothing to do with who she actually was. An improbable life. A difficult one. A lonely one, too. But undeniably human. And perhaps that is what matters most in the end. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.